All right, so tonight we're going to continue exploring the life of Solomon. Mark did a fantastic job starting us off last time. So we get to the point we're going to be camping out in 1 Kings chapter 3 and 4. 2 Chronicles 1 is kind of a very similar recap as well. So if you want to be turning to 1 Kings 3. So Solomon is, at least at the marrying age at this point, and in the beginning of chapter 3, we see him marrying one of the many foreign wives that he's going to marry eventually. This is most likely was done for political expedience. He's marrying the daughter of Pharaoh to make an alliance with Egypt, and we know from our own history, even all the way through the 20th century, the monarchs of various countries would intermarry, trying to create additional bonds between various countries and bring peace and reconciliation. So this is no different. We're going to see that, unfortunately, this is going to be his Achilles heel. So Solomon, as when we were studying Gideon, right, we talked about how these are real people. They're not just made up characters, and they have real character flaws. They have real character triumphs, and Solomon is no different. We're not going to necessarily repeat the same style as we did with Gideon, but it's something worth mentioning that Solomon, at this point in his life, as we're going to see, is a servant of God. He's walking with God. He is doing a great job as the king of Israel, but we're starting to see kind of the chink in the armor, so to speak, which was his relationship with his wives, many wives that he had, and what their impact on him. So in chapter 11, we actually see the Bible explicitly tell us that they have turned his heart away from God. And this man who was walking with God, who was walking in his father's footsteps, ended up pursuing the passion of the flesh, and then he ended up giving in to his wives, and even building altars in other high places for false deities and worshiping them. And so it's really sad that by the end of his life, he really deviated from the path. But back here, we're still in chapter 3 of 1 Kings. It's kind of the golden age of Israel and the golden age of King Solomon. So starting out in verse 3 of chapter 3, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Why do you think he went to high places instead of going to the temple to offer sacrifices? There was no temple. Yes, thanks, Mark. So there were two temples, the first temple, the second temple. So there are remnants of one of the retaining walls of the second temple that was built about 500, I believe, 16 BC, and then was refurbished and kind of updated by King Herod in about 20 BC. The remnant of it is what was called today the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall in Jerusalem. It's the most holy place in all Judaism. But it's not actually the wall of the temple. But the first temple was the one that Solomon is about to build, and Jesse's going to be covering it next time. So there was no temple at this time. He didn't have a house yet. It says in verse 2 that his house is not built, the walls aren't built, the temple is not built. He is the great builder that's going to be bringing in all his materials, and he's going to be building up Jerusalem. But at the moment, they're going to these high places to offer sacrifices. The high places were kind of local and regional worship centers. And most of the time, people in those high places worshipped idols, right? There was a bunch of different deities, false deities that they have worshipped. And you'll see throughout 1 Kings a reference to those and how jealous the Lord was for his people who instead of worshiping him were worshiping idols. So Solomon seems to be appropriately using these places. He is sacrificing to the Lord, and he is doing these massive offerings, thousands of burnt offerings. So the key passage here is what we're starting with. Solomon loved the Lord, and he walked in the footsteps of his father, King David. That's always a good start. When you love the Lord, is a good starting point, and you'll be guaranteed success if you do. So I'm going to jump into this verse. This is one of the key verses in both of these chapters that jumps out at us. It says that in verse 10, it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And we're going to cover what this was in just a minute. But it's really incredible that it said of Solomon that he did something that it pleased the Lord. And so I recommend that when we see something like this, we really pay attention, right? It's like, okay, well, I want to please the Lord. What did he do? And let's learn from him. But before we jump into what he did, I want to cover something that is the opposite of this. Sometimes it's beneficial to learn about whatever concept, right, by looking at the antithesis of that, the opposite. So the little spoiler, right? He asked about wisdom, and that he was going to use for the benefit of God's people. So that's this in this passage. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the world's wisdom instead of God's wisdom, because that's what we're surrounded with, right? The wisdom of this world and how this impacts us today. So I want to show you this. Does anybody know the gentleman's name on the right? I know some of you probably know. Yeah, this is Professor Richard Dawkins, who is a world-renowned biologist, educated in Oxford. He is also, he taught many places. He has multiple degrees, including a PhD, I believe in zoology or biology, one of them. He teaches back at Oxford. He taught all over the world. He teaches back at Oxford. He is one of the most outspoken critics of faith and Christianity specifically, as you will see in the next slide in just a minute. And he is self-professed atheist, and he is one of the most ardent supporters of Darwin's theory of evolution. The reason I put him up here, and so tonight we're not going to criticize Dr. Dawkins. This is not a session to beat up on him or to judge him or judge his heart. We're going to use just the facts. So he sponsored this campaign. He's one of the sponsors of this campaign in the UK. This lady next to him was a British entertainer. I honestly don't even know her name, but they are collaborating on this, and I think there are other people as well. I was actually looking for a different sign. I was just searching the internet because I saw this sign one time. This gentleman was holding a cardboard sign that said, "There is no God. Do not fear, just live your life." That's what that sign said. I couldn't find it, so I found something similar. Professor Dawkins inserts the word "probably" in here. Maybe he's not 100% sure, but you will see in just a minute that I'm pretty sure that he is sure there is no God. So the statement, right? And so they put all these mobile ads all over London, all these buses that have the same message, right? There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. That's the message. I'm imagining they're trying to address people like us because we're the ones that believe there is a God, and presumably we're the ones that pay a lot of attention to this. So you can't see it, it's too faint, but over here is the different websites that are sponsors of this, and one of them is Dr. Dawkins' personal website. So let's just take a look at this. This is the wisdom that we're surrounded with today. And not only us, but our children are surrounded by this. And some of you old folks who have grandchildren, young folks like Tom, you are also surrounded by this kind of messaging. And so it's extremely impactful because most of us naturally do not want to not conform, right? We human beings do not like to stand out. They like to belong. This message is not just from Dr. Dawkins and this lady next to him, right? There are millions of people who profess this kind of philosophy, meaning, okay, we all believe in this entity that doesn't exist. We can't see him, never encountered him, can't touch him. They don't even believe he exists, but we do. And so we spend our whole life worrying because we're just trying to please this entity, right? This deity. And we bend our will to his. We follow these rules. We're not having any fun. We're abstaining from things that are fun. And so they see us as just somebody who is wasting their lives away because we're chasing this this mythical being, right? And they have all sorts of different names for God. They're, very, critical or derogatory names. Like, here's your daddy in the sky, whatever. I won't go into all of them. But that's the message. Basically, we're not very smart because we're wasting our lives chasing something that doesn't exist. What's interesting is that if there is no God, and more specifically, if there's no resurrection, Apostle Paul would tend to agree with Dr. Dawkins, then it's all pointless, right? If there's no resurrection, then we are miserable. And what are we all doing here? Of course, the point that Apostle Paul makes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and next is that there is resurrection, and thus there's this hope. Dr. Dawkins doesn't believe that. So this is pretty benign, right? Okay, it's not insulting. It's not, okay, he makes this point, the bus goes by, you can just ignore the bus, right? Now, I want you to read this. And now, this is very hard to read. Richard Dawkins wrote multiple books, including the book called The God Delusion. They are bestsellers on Amazon and other places, okay? Lots of people read them. This is what he said. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, I can pronounce this name, or this word, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, and so forth. Okay, you can kind of see where he's getting some of these things, right? I mean, what he's referring to. Like, for example, ethnic cleanser and genocidal, that could be the conquest of Jericho, right? And some of these issues, and I think Taylor is going to tackle some of them on Saturday. There are difficult questions in the Bible. Like the conquest of Jericho is a very difficult question. God did instruct them to go wipe everybody out, including women and children. That's why? And how does that jive with his character of love? That's a question that needs to be answered. But Dr. Dawkins already, instead of really discussing it, he already judged God to be unjust. But so you go through all these different things, right? I learned a few words I didn't know. So apparently this word is philia. It's basically when parents murder their children. So this is referring to most likely the test that Abraham was given, right, to kill Isaac, and so forth. Why did I highlight these three words in bold, do you think? I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay, key buzzwords used today. Somebody else has? Yeah. So I don't think anybody's going to be accusing us of any of these other things, right? Like being thirsty about our infinite power, or being wanting to kill children and so forth. Right? I don't think anybody's going to be accusing us of that. These other three right here is what we're going to be called. We are called, right? And our children are called, and our grandchildren are called. And this is what we have to face. Because the wisdom of the world today is that people who believe in the Bible, who follow God, and who believe in Jesus, who tell people that there is sin, and they should change, and they should repent from all this different unrighteousness that they're doing, they are homophobic and racist and misogynistic. And that's hard to hear. Nobody wants to be called that. So I just wanted to put this out here because it's easy to study Solomon and to nod our heads that, yeah, he was wise and he asked for great things and it's wonderful. It is. But ladies and gentlemen, like, we're facing people like this, right? Who don't appreciate Solomon's wisdom, who don't appreciate God, who have a very low opinion of him. And this is difficult especially for our little ones. I have a child who was impacted tremendously in high school by people like this, right? And it's not Dr. Richard Dawkins' fault. He's a free moral agent. He can think whatever he wants to think and say whatever he wants to say. He will be judged for that on the last day. But people like him impacted my son, and they can impact your son or your daughter. So just something to keep in mind. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by this whatsoever. Jesus gave us this warning. If the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. So not to be doom and gloom, but this is coming, right? We see the degradation of our society. We see how words about sin and righteousness are becoming hate speech and so forth. Like, we need to get ready, because the world's not going to applaud wisdom like Solomon's. The world's going to do more and more of this. So, back to our story, or back to our account, historical account. In verse 8, this is what Solomon, so what did he ask for that God was pleased with, right? In verse 8 it says, and your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people. So what did Solomon ask for of God? Wisdom. Right. So when he was worshiping in one of those high places, God came to him in a dream and said, I'm going to give you what you asked me for. And so Solomon went through and said, I really appreciate what you did for my dad, and how you were with my dad, and how you crowned me king. And here's what I want to ask of. And this is what he's asking God for wisdom. What specifically is he planning to use his wisdom on? Yes, he wants to know the difference between good and evil for the purpose of helping govern God's people. There's a huge multitude of people. Sometimes I think we don't have an appreciation for how many people this is and logistics that it takes, right? If there were around roughly 2 million Jews that left Egypt, right? That's a lot of logistics. I mean, at my wedding, there were, I believe, a couple hundred guests. Now, if it was up to me, I would have gone the Tom and Amy Stevenson route and, spend $20 on the license and be done with that. But that my wife did. She's not here, so I can say that. So she wanted a wedding, so there were 200 plus guests. My in-laws spent, I believe, 10 months preparing for all this. Now, once again, I just showed up when I was told to show up, but I rented a tux, so that was my contribution. 200 people was a lot of people to prepare for, to entertain and feed and all this. Now, 2 million people, that's a whole different story. And they have to eat 3 times a day, and they've got to travel long distances, and they don't have air conditioning, and they don't have water, and they don't have food, and they're fighting with each other. And I mean, can you even imagine? Now, by this point, we're talking about that the Jews are compared to like the sand on the seashore. And he's in charge. King Solomon is in charge. So he's asking God, please give me wisdom so I can govern your people that you have brought here, who are completely numerous. And as Tom said, what is it? I want to know the difference between good and evil. Now, once again, 21st century, 2023, the whole thing is erased, right? There is no good and evil. I get to define my own, you get to define your own. It's all relative, right? Yeah, exactly. It's his own standard. So Solomon asks for the right thing, and now we see the blessings that the Lord pours out. By the way, what he did not ask, well, we'll see. He did not ask for anything but wisdom. Starting in verse 10 through 14. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you walk with in my ways, keeping the statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. God said, nobody before you and nobody after you will be as wise as you, right? How do we measure intelligence? What's our test on intelligence? IQ test, right? Not super accurate. It's subjective. So some of the people with the highest IQ that we know are like Albert Einstein, but apparently Albert Einstein couldn't compare to Solomon, right? And Richard Dawkins, to all his dismay, probably can't compare it to Solomon either. So the Lord not only blesses him with this wisdom and discernment, he says, I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for, which was various riches and long life conditionally if he follows in the footsteps of his father David in righteousness. We're going to see in a few minutes what the size of this blessing in just a minute. So let's talk about a story that follows in starting verse 16. So I grew up behind the Iron Curtain. I started all my stories with my children when I was a little boy in Russia, and they just know, okay, Dad's going to tell us some Russian story. So when I was a little boy in Russia, I've heard of this story. Like that's something, even in the atheistic society that I grew up in, it wasn't presented as historical, but this story was of these two women and how they would divide this child. Was even behind the Iron Curtain, this story was used as an example of wisdom. So that tells you something. So you have two prostitutes who apparently live in the same household, and they both become pregnant pretty close to each other. They give birth within 3 days of each other. And so one of them ends up accidentally rolling over on the child and killing him or her. Which is what they tell you, do not put your baby in the bed with you, but we all have done it because we're desperate for sleep. But this is tragedy because what she does, and she switches this child with the one that actually was living, and in the morning when the sun comes, and the mother whose child was not dead recognizes this travesty, they start arguing, right? And they both claim that the child is theirs. Now, this is before, the little barcodes, right, on their wrists, and there's no midwives, or at least they didn't have. It doesn't sound like there was any other witness to the situation except these two. So they go in front of the king. And what's really interesting is the way that they asked him to judge the situation. So he recaps it in verse 23. He's basically just thinking out, you can tell he's just thinking out loud. He's going through the logic of the situation, and then in verse 24, there's no indication that he thought about it for a week or he just kind of, asked for somebody else's opinion. And he had the solution, right? And it was a brilliant solution. So he capitalizes on the motherly instinct, and he asked for a sword to be brought, and he just said, cut this baby in half and just give each one to so they both have what they want at that point. And of course the real mother intervenes and says, no, just give it to this other woman. I just want this kid to live. And the other woman says, no, 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 let's divide them. So he immediately could tell who the real mother was. That's a brilliant solution, right? I don't know if any of us would have thought about that. We might have had some other ideas, but the entire nation heard about this in verse 28. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So the important part is that they didn't come and said, oh, we have this brilliant king. I mean, look at us. We're the great nation, like these other nations. You guys don't have a king like this. This is our king, and he's so wise. They gave God the glory, right? It was obvious that this wisdom was from the Lord, and so he received the glory as he should have. So we're going to talk about lessons, for us. So, what if we don't have wisdom? How do we ask for it, and why don't we have it? So James said in chapter 4, verse 2, if you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend on your passions. Remember, why did Solomon ask for wisdom? What was his purpose? To bless God's people, to take care of God's people. He didn't ask for himself. And so, if we want to ask God for wisdom, we need to make sure that our motives are pure. We're not doing this so we can get a promotion at our job, or ego on Facebook or likes or whatever, social media, whatever, right? We need to ask for wisdom in order to apply it for God's glory, or we're not going to receive it. So James, once again, in chapter 1, gives very direct instructions on specifically how to ask for wisdom. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So when we ask for wisdom, we need to believe that God, who can do anything, can grant us this wisdom, right? We need to ask in faith without doubting, and we need to ask it for God's glory, not our own. So, unselfishly, right? When we ask for wisdom, we need to ask for it unselfishly, without doubting, without manipulation. What I mean by that is, we could look at this example and say, oh, I got this. I know how to get more out of God than, I can manipulate him. So I'm gonna be like Solomon. I'm gonna ask for wisdom, for something really good, something really unselfish, and to glorify God. But secretly, I'm gonna hope that, just like Solomon, I'm gonna get showered with this other stuff. That God is gonna, just like with Solomon, he's gonna give me money, and he's gonna give me a long life, and he's not gonna give me 1,000 wives, because that's lack of wisdom. But anyways, God knows every thought and every inclination of our heart. There's no point in trying to manipulate him, right? Don't ask for something and hoping that he'll give you something like a little bonus. He'll give his own bonuses according to his plan, right? We should ask it with sincerity. And if we truly want to help his kingdom, that's what we need to ask for, right? And we need to be honest. If we're trying to ask for ourselves, okay, then ask for yourself. But the way he said to ask is unselfishly, without doubting, and don't try to manipulate me. And the last one I put on there, the last bullet, intend to apply this wisdom appropriately. What I mean by that is, there are areas of judgment, right? So, for example, I did find a new job, but I was looking for a new job, and let's say there are multiple opportunities, and they both seem, or multiple opportunities, they seem, kosher, right? Like these are good jobs, they're honest work, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of them. Which one should I choose? There are pluses and minuses with each one. I don't really know exactly which one to choose. So, if there's no moral judgment if they're both morally up to par, then I need to ask God for wisdom to be able to choose which one, because it's going to be better for him, for the kingdom, for my family, for the future, so forth, right? In the area of judgment. Now, there's some things that God was extremely direct on, right? And asking him for wisdom in a situation that you already have an answer to is disingenuous. So for example, I'm married to my wife 23 years, but I decided, I'm just kind of done with her, so I'm just going to go and pursue this other woman. And I love her, and I want her, and so, but I can't do this without God's blessing, so I'm going to pray and I'm going to ask God for wisdom. What should I do, God, in this situation? Right? The answer is in Matthew chapter 19 and in Matthew chapter 5. It's right there, or Genesis. The answer is right there, right? Asking God for wisdom where he already explicitly said something is disingenuous and wrong. If you know the right thing, don't be asking God, is this the right thing to do? Right? It's like our kids. Sometimes we tell them, hey, you need to go to bed at certain time, or whatever. Give them some sort of rule, and they try to manipulate us and try to find a way around that. Right? They ask all these questions. Or they go to a different parent and they ask him or her, trying to manipulate. Like, if you know the right thing and it's not an area of judgment, then you just do it. Right? It's simple. It's straightforward. Right? Wisdom is needed on things that are complex, areas of judgment, right? Better interpretation of the text. There's some parts of the text that are difficult to interpret. We know that because Peter said that of Paul's writings. He said, man, that stuff is hard. Whatever this guy's writing is hard sometimes. So it's difficult to interpret certain passages. We need wisdom, absolutely, to be able to do that. But things that are black and white, simple, there's no need to ask because you're just trying to get a different answer. Before we jump into chapter 4, any comments or feedback on the conversation about wisdom? Yes, ma'am.
And also have to remember it's his will, not ours, when we're praying for certain things.
Yes. Agreed. Tammy says we need to remember that it's his will, not ours, when we pray. Yes, absolutely.
Whatever it needs.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, I apologize if somebody's hungry about this photo. But, so chapter 4, this is the golden age of Israel, right? They are abundant, it's peacetime, there's plenty of food, they have a wise king on the throne, he's following in the footsteps of his father. So this is a really interesting tidbit. We get to see the logistics of his reign, like the names of his officials. Now, I'll be honest, I couldn't get through the list. These names are really difficult, and I was trying to figure out why the Lord put them in there. I don't know. Maybe, to them it all made sense. Like, for example, if you were reading history 50 years from now of 2023, we could go through and figure out who the Secretary of Defense was and the Secretary of State was and the President. Well, that's a little harder who the President is, but okay, that's my political joke for the night. We know who the President is and so forth. And so to us, it makes sense. People 1,000 years from now are not going to know who John Biden was. So it's probably similar here, but we see that there's this very well orchestrated administration. But what's really interesting is this whole conversation about provisions for the king. Okay, they basically had 12 officials that were in charge of 12 territories or regions, and they were supposed to supply the provisions for the king and all of his large household and people in his entourage. So it goes through, and each one provided the entire month. So I don't know if there was a disadvantage or advantage to certain months, but apparently they did that pretty happily. It doesn't record that there was any kind of complaining. They made sure that the king was well taken care of. And so I wanted to do a little fun math, because I was like, okay, well, 30 cores of fine flour, I don't know what that is. I can barely do the American measurement system. I think it's terrible, but metric rules. But I don't know what 30 cores of flour was. So I thought, okay, well, let me just look it up. So apparently it's around 5 bushels of flour. That doesn't tell me much either. So on average, it's between 42 and 65 pounds. Okay, now we're getting something closer. 65 pounds of flour. So let's say 45. We're just on the lower end and make math easy. 30 quarts of flour is almost 7,000 pounds of flour. Okay? Now, these are daily provisions for one day. Okay? So I looked up, okay, how much flour do you need to bake a loaf of bread? It's about a pound. That's 7,000 loaves in one day. Okay? So I'm not sure what 60 quarts of meal mean. I'm not sure what kind of meal, but 10 fat oxen. Okay, let's take a side of beef, right? A cow. So if you have a family of 5 and each person eats 8 ounces of beef a day, that's enough for about a year and a half. This one cow. Okay? Blake, to cut that in half. Okay. So this is one day. So you do the math, and this is enough. The 10 oxen is to feed 20,000 people. Plus they had pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, deer, birds, and so forth, fowls, so forth. So I started thinking, like, okay, Solomon, okay, he had 1,000 wives / concubines. They had their entourage. He had a bunch of, friends and so forth. That is a lot of people to feed, be able to feed, right? Every single day. Now, some of these probably were used for sacrifices. We know that he sacrificed a lot. So the reference is, if I remember correctly, in chapter 3, if we back up, in verse 15, and Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. So I'm sure it was fun to have the king as your friend, because you'll be well fed. He also had chariots. He had, one version says 40,000, another version says 4,000 stalls of horses. I don't think it matters if it's 40 or 4. It's a lot of horses, and 12,000 horsemen and so forth. The point I'm trying to make is these blessings came from the Lord in addition to his wisdom. This is what he did not ask for, but was blessed anyhow. Just like the people, when he spoke and when he made judgment calls, knew that this was from God, you better believe it, they knew all this stuff is from God too. The amount of blessings that were freely flowing into this household and his entourage and so forth is absolutely astounding. These are God's blessings. But I want us to, in the last 7 minutes, and my goal is to end early so there's no stop sign, and I'm going to try to deprive Curtis of that pleasure. Okay, Solomon is dead and gone. We don't have the same blessings as Solomon. We don't have the same wisdom as Solomon, because he was more wise than anybody after him. That includes us, and that's okay. We don't have, sometimes I feel like I'm paying for this much food for Blake, but we don't have this amount of food flowing and somebody else providing it freely to us. And that's okay too. We have this, and we must never forget this. We have a gift that blows all the blessings of Solomon out of the water. And we have a gift that's the only thing we need. If we eat bread and drink water and sleep in a cardboard box, and we have Jesus Christ, that's all we need. So Paul said, thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift. Other words say unspeakable gift. We don't even have the words to describe it. That's the blessing. And Paul says in Ephesians chapter 3, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. He can do more abundantly than we ask or even think. And I don't think he meant, thank you, Chris. I don't think he meant wisdom. I don't think he meant beef or flour or food or shelter or cars. I think he meant just Jesus. And so that's the lesson for us. And that's the lesson that we can teach others, that that's all they need. And God is ready and willing to give it. Thank you.